The Neptune Project, in partnership with the National Science Foundation, the W.M. Keck Foundation, the University of Washington, the Pacific Northwest Gigapod, and the Research Channel, is proud to present Visions 05, Expedition to the Underwater Volcanoes of the Northeast Pacific.
Welcome to the Juan de Fuca Ridge. It's only about 2.2 kilometers beneath us here. We were on camera here yesterday and we could barely see anything. The winds were blowing at about 35 knots. The waves were pretty gigantic. The day before, it was fairly benign, quite benign. And what's happened here in the last 3.5 hours is that a major front has moved through, and we've got 18-foot swells coming from the northwest with winds at about 18 knots, and the waves and the winds and the swells are all working together at this point. But as is often the case, as a transition in the weather takes place, the sun comes out and it looks much more engaging than it did before. Well, oceanography is in a transition as well. Oceanography is in the transition from the more traditional way we've done science in the past, using ships alone or satellites in conjunction and sometimes moorings. But now, as you can see by the fact that we're bringing high definition television from the surface of the ship, the surface of the ocean, into your studio or your room or your living room or your laboratory or classroom, we're doing something we haven't done before. And we're going to do more of this in oceanography, and there's a very good reason for doing this. Oceanography is one of those incredible sciences that touches all nations and touches all people, in that the conditions that exist on the continents and in the coastlines, in the Sahel, south of the Sahara, in the Gobi Desert, in Kansas, anywhere you want, the ocean is a strong influence in what actually takes place in terms of weather, in terms of climate, in terms of crop production, anything of that sort. We need to understand the ocean. Well, the ocean basins cover 66% of the planet, and we tend not to think of them because we live on the other 33%. And when we come out here, we realize that what we're looking at is the top of the ocean, which is driven by sunlight. The two driving forces, the two sources of energy for oceanography, for driving the ocean, its motion, have to do with the sunlight, which operates on the surface of the planet, and a much deeper source of energy down inside the planet, which is the residual heat of the interior and the heat that's driven by radioactivity from the interior portion of the planet. And the interface between those two takes place somewhere between where we are and where we are out here to study, which is the seafloor. The upper portion of the ocean has many processes. You can see on the graphic, you can see the myriad processes that are taking place. And as we scan down across that graphic, you begin to realize that the lower portion of the ocean is begun to be dominated by the deep processes within the Earth. And that's the fascinating part of this planet. So what we're here to talk about in specific on this particular cruise is the part of the system that is associated with spreading centers. Now you can see that the plate tectonic process is taking place, or is shown in a graphic, and you can actually see a portion of that which focuses on the spreading center, where molten rock, magma, underneath the crust is actually welling up into places on the seafloor producing lava. That lava is 1200 degrees centigrade, 2200 degrees Fahrenheit, and where it interacts with the oceans, either below the seafloor or on the seafloor, it creates convection. And the fluid moves through the crust, removing chemistry from the crust and bringing it to the surface where it feeds microbes and other larger animals. So a small part of all the processes that we talked about in the ocean is what we're studying here. Now, how are we doing it? We'll come back to a lot of that in this program, but how do we actually do what we're doing now? The star of this show, in terms of the capabilities that we have to work this system on the seafloor, is called Jason. And I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Deborah Kelly, who a little bit earlier spent time with Jonathan Howland to look over Jason and talk about how Jason works and share with you the elegance of this robot that we are using routinely on the seafloor when the weather allows us to do that. Deb?
We're going to take a brief tour here of the vehicles that let us do some of our underwater work. And to take that tour, Jonathan Howland, who's part of the Jason team, is going to show us some of the remarkable technology that lets us do our science at over 1.5 miles down beneath the surface of the ocean. Jonathan?
Sure. Yeah, this is the Jason ROV. ROV stands for Remotely Operated Vehicle. I'm part of a team of people that built this vehicle 2 or 3 years ago for the purpose of doing science. The difference between Jason and the thousands of other ROVs that are in the world, working in the world, is that Jason was purpose-built to do science. We have a team of 10 people out here that operate it to help people like Deb accomplish what they want. So to take a look at Jason, Jason is really a two-part system. We have the Jason vehicle that you're seeing here, and we have Medea, the rather ugly-looking plump weight back there. The purpose of Medea is to separate the motion of the ship. You can probably see the ship moving up and down with the waves. We need to separate these vehicles from the motion of the ship. Jason has to stay in one spot on the seafloor, sometimes within a few centimeters, so that people like Deb can accomplish their science. So Medea heaves up and down with the ship. Medea is attached to Jason via a flexible fiber optic cable. That cable has power and data, comes from Medea to Jason. All right, so now Jason is stable. Jason is a little bit light usually, so that if we were to break this tether, it would float to the surface. So Jason is a little bit light, and we use thrusters to keep it where we want it. You can see some of the thrusters here. This is a lateral thruster. I'm sorry. This is a horizontal thruster. Helps Jason turn and move forward and back. We've got a vertical thruster over here. This is what Jason uses to move up and down. We can do station keeping in all three axes like a helicopter. Jason's a lot more like a helicopter than an airplane. We can hover, and we can keep our position to within about that far in the water and about that far horizontally, a small box about that far. All that to help us do science. The key to that, by the way, are some sensors that you probably can't see. They're underneath the vehicle. Doppler sonars, high-frequency navigation systems. Other parts of the vehicle you can see these egg-like things. This is where we house the motor controllers that actually drive the thrusters. This is what's called a junction box. In the junction box, we connect the sensors, things like this. We connect those sensors to the large housings. These are very large, about that big in diameter, hollow titanium tubes. That's where all the electronics are. We connect the electronics to those sensors via this junction box. All right, let's move around to the front of the vehicle.
So Jonathan, if this vehicle is so heavy, how do you make it so it's trimmed light?
Well, Jason weighs around, we need a weight loss program. We're around 8,700 pounds right now. This material here, this is syntactic foam, which is very heavy on deck here right now, but floats in the water. It provides flotation to us. In fact, we have weight distributed around the vehicle. There are actually lead plates distributed around the vehicle that help us keep it trim. And also, in fact, given the amount of stuff you put on this trip, we're not really trimmed very well. We're sort of nose down most of the time. That's because of all this stuff we have in the front of the vehicle. So we use two manipulator arms here and here. The pilots who operate the vehicle use those to affect the operations that scientists like Deb want. Deb, why don't you show us some of the tools
Sure.
that we use?
So one of the challenges when you can sort of think of Medea and Jason is on a yo-yo when it's attached to the boat. The ship is heaving a lot, particularly on a day like today. So one of the challenges of the pilots is how do we get our science done when it can be kind of wavy sometimes. And these are titanium bottles. The extreme environments events, it's a very harsh environment. The fluids are acidic. Since we're about a mile and a half down, that's very, very high pressure. So, and the fluids come out of these hot smokers at about 700 degrees Fahrenheit. So there's some pretty good challenges in getting materials that let us do our work there. This is one of the bottles that we use to sample fluids out of the black smoker chimneys. Again, it's all titanium. It's basically a evacuated bottle that has a big cylinder in it. You can think of it as a plunger. Basically, it just sucks up the fluid. You stick the nozzle, it fits into the arm adjacent, into the claws. We use these T-handles so Jason can grab onto it. And you can imagine the orifices of the chimneys are about this big around. So here we have this vehicle on a very, very long tether at the bottom of the seafloor trying to stick the bottle, the nozzle, down into the black smoker chimney. So it's a pretty good feat. One of the great things that we have that Jonathan can talk about a little bit more is these fantastic cameras. Particularly on this show, we have this high definition camera that's really let us see images of the seafloor we've never seen before. We have a variety of different sensors that we use. One of the things we want to know is the temperature of the fluids. So there's basically a big thermometer, again, that we can stick into the black smokers and get temperatures of the fluids. And you can imagine on the seafloor, even doing a manipulation like that can be pretty challenging. There's pretty good currents down there, and so it takes a lot of, if you're a kid and are good at using joysticks for video games, you'd probably make a really good pilot.
Okay, so we're a mile and a half down. It's kind of dark down there. We have to carry our own lights. You can see up on the brow of the vehicle a whole array of lights. We carry those with us. That's what we have to use to see. And a variety of cameras. The analogy people use is it's like going into a dark room with just a flashlight. You can only see what you're illuminating. Very small field of view. So we have a couple of cameras that are on pan and tilts. These can turn and tilt up and down. This is the pilot's pan and tilt. This is the one that we give to science so they can look at something that's different than what the pilot's using. The pilot has to usually pay attention to driving this vehicle, and the scientists want to look around. And then this is the high def camera that we're talking about. It's kind of big, very heavy, mounted on Jason right now. All we can do is tilt this up and down, so we provide the pan motion, the looking around, by actually turning the vehicle. And this has provided just a spectacular footage, better than what we're used to seeing with the other cameras that we have here. Okay.
So one of the other things that we need to do is bring up samples off of the sea floor. And Jason's got this really nice front porch, we call it, that basically is hydraulically operated. So when you're working really up close to a chimney and you need more room, this whole front porch can slide partway under the vehicle. When you need samples and you need a porch space, it basically slides back out. And you can see that it actually has quite a large workspace to put a lot of equipment down. On this cruise, because we have so many new sensors that we're developing to put on the seafloor, on a typical dive, a lot of this front porch would be filled up with different kinds of sensors. And again, everything that we use out here is made out of titanium to withstand the high pressures. The seawater is corrosive, as well as the fluids that are coming out of the chimneys. So it's a great game trying to get everything in place and use this vehicle. The lights that they have really illuminate quite a large area of the seafloor on this cruise now. And the high-def camera lets us zoom into individual chimneys and look at the animals that live there.
Deb, thanks very much. I know you and Jonathan conducted that little tour before the front passed through here, leaving the sun shining. So we appreciate that. It was very informative. I think I learned a few things as well, so thanks a lot. I want to talk a little bit before we introduce the next major player in terms of our equipment out here. I want to talk a little bit about oceanography in transition. I said the weather is in transition. Oceanography is in transition. And what we've done very well in the past is go to places or map the seafloor in one way or another with a resolution that is acceptable. If you all recall, the name Mark Twain refers to the way they used to map the seafloor. They used a lead line, and you can imagine mapping the seafloor with a lead line when the water is 2 miles deep. It takes a long time to get a data point. We'll come back to that. But as we learn how to map the seafloor, we begin to wonder also about how the seafloor changes. and how the life on the seafloor changes, and how the life in the ocean changes, and how the life and the ocean itself changes. So recently, in the last 20 years, and certainly in the last 5, there's a strong preoccupation with time. The time domain becomes extraordinarily important to us. And by going to sea in ships for a month every year, we don't capture the full time domain. The issues that we face in a way are in some ways captured in other forms of our culture. There's this great preoccupation with time. What is time? In fact, if you'll forgive me for a moment, T.S. Eliot had this to say about time. Time present and time past are both present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been remains a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been leads to one end, which is now. Right now, we are seeking to integrate the time and the space that are involved in how the world of the oceanography, or the world of ocean basins changes. And one of the most powerful tools we now have to look at the spatial variation, and we'll come to the time dimension later, the spatial variation is a brand new tool that has been developed by a group of folks at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Dana Yerger and Al Bradley are the 2 leaders of the team, and Al Duster and Andy Giddings are with us on board as well. Now, Dana is standing by here with me, and I'm anxious to introduce him. We've been friends for a very long time, and we'll talk a little more about some of the things we did earlier, but he is standing here with our grad student, Deb Kelly's, and my grad student, Deborah Glickson, who is doing her dissertation on mapping of the sea floor. And the new tool that we're using is standing behind Dana, and Dana will introduce, as lovingly as you have ever heard anybody introduce any tool, Dana will introduce Abe to you.
Well, thanks, John. As John mentioned, Abe is a fully autonomous robot. That means once we launch it from the ship, it's completely on its own. It maps the seafloor with a variety of sensors. On this cruise, we've been primarily mapping the bathymetry, or the shape of the seafloor, and but we also mapped the near bottom water with Abe on a number of cruises. And again, Abe is fully autonomous. It knows where it is precisely all the time, and that's what enables us to make maps with real spatial accuracy. The other important aspect about Abe is that it's a working tool. We've used it on over a dozen cruises all over the world. It's mapped over 3,000 kilometers of bottom tracks, mostly on mid-ocean ridge, very challenging environments. Another important feature about an autonomous vehicle like Abe is it can be very complementary to some of the other tools that we've talked about today. In particular, it's very complementary to both an ROV like Jason and also the Alvin submersible that we operate at Woods Hole. On this particular cruise, we've had Abe and Jason working the seafloor simultaneously for a large fraction of our time out here. And in particular, we've added a new capability to Abe. When Abe's batteries start to run low, rather than returning to the surface, it anchors itself to the seafloor, which enables Jason to complete its work uninterrupted. After we recover Jason, then we go get Abe. Another variation on that was we used that anchoring capability to wait out some bad weather yesterday, which was very important. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Deb Glickson, and she's going to talk a little bit about the maps Abe makes and why they're important.
Thanks, Dana. The great thing about Abe is that you can, as he said, look at the shape of the seafloor. What he didn't mention is that you can actually use it at several different heights. So you can look at the large-scale rich morphology, or you could zoom all the way down if you fly lower in altitude to actually see details of the ridge itself, down to the vent fields, down to the actual vent structures. And that's just totally cool. But it does only give you the shape of the seafloor. We use tools like Jason to look at the visuals. We go and we actually drive along the seafloor so we can look at the basalt and how its different types are forming. We can look at the faults and fissures, and then we can look at how those interact with the vent locations and where the flow is happening. And it's basically a great integration of those two tools that makes geologic mapping the powerful tool that it can be. I use those to look at how the surface looks and then infer the processes of what's going on. What's going on in the subsurface and how that has changed over time. How we've had volcanic activity, which we can see through collapse features on the bottom. How we've had tectonic extension, which we see through faults and fissures. All of those things together are a very powerful tool for my work. What they also do, though, is integrate well with the other data that's going on. Mapping puts the data that the other researchers are working on in context. Basically, we can use all this data together. What's going on the seafloor, how the chemistry is changing over time, where the microbes are, what the seismology is telling us about the interior of the Earth, and basically make all those things work together.
Great. One other point I'd like to make about all the vehicles that you're seeing, Abe, Jason, it's great to see the final end product, but it's important to remember that when you see a spectacular data product from any of these vehicles, that's the product of the efforts of a large team of people. Every single part of that vehicle probably had to work almost flawlessly to produce that result. And in this case, with Abe, all of our groups, the mechanical systems run by Andy Billings, the electrical systems run by Al Duster, the ship's crew that gets the vehicle over the side and back aboard safely. So these are really complex systems, and I urge everybody to remember, when you see that end product, that means a lot of people with a lot of different kinds of skills did a really good job.
I'd like to make another comment about my interaction with Dana, and we'll be moving into the lab here very shortly. But Dana, do you remember when the two of us were on that National Academy Committee in the mid-90s? The plan that we hatched over the second pitcher of beer about picking up a big rock from the seafloor?
Yes, I certainly remember that conversation.
Well, remember what you said when we were doing that. You said to me, John, if we pick up that big rock from the seafloor, what we really need to do is map it first. Remember?
Sure.
And as I recall, you had told me that if we mapped it, we could use Jason. We could use Jason in some kind of controlled form. And I didn't know what you were talking about, but you were very intense about it. And so I just basically thought, okay, the guy knows what he's talking about, and besides, he bought the picture, so let's do it. And then we went and got the funds to support that program from the American Museum of Natural History. Our colleague Ed Mate was helping us do that. And we even had some REVEL teachers on board at that time. But I'd like you to sort of briefly say something about what the mapping consisted of, because we're looking at one of the products here as a backdrop to this conversation. And this is one of the really enjoyable parts of our interaction that I've loved so much over the years.
Well, one of the important parts I mentioned about Abe is Abe knows where it is very precisely at all times. The same is true of Jason. In fact, a lot of the capabilities that we have in Abe, we learned how to make happen working with Jason. And so the idea of doing this precise survey of the Mothra site was we would exploit Jason's ability for very precise computer control. It's one thing to go take pictures of something. It's far more useful to take pictures in a very controlled, structured way where you know the precise position and orientation of the vehicle at all times. That allows those pictures to be assembled into a quantitative perspective that you can't get if you just simply fly around the structures and get complete coverage. So that's what we did with Jason on the Mothra site, and that enabled Mitch to assemble the image that you see right here, because that data was taken in such an organized and structured manner.
It wasn't until Mitchell began working with the images that we began to realize what a stunning product we had gotten. So Mitch, could you just talk a little about what you see here?
Yeah, this is really cool. This is about 50 meters across. The tower here is about 20 meters. It's about the size of a 6-story building. Now you can go down in a submarine, you can go down in a submersible, you could turn on all the halogen lights you want to, and you're not going to see a picture like this. This is painstaking work. The vehicle came down here 3 meters away, thereabouts, and took thousands of images of this structure all the way around. what I did is I went through and I sorted through these images, and I found the transects up and down, pieced them together just using normal image processing software, and came out with this huge image. This is pretty much the first time this has ever been seen, standing off and just looking at it.
And let me just point out that all of you that are watching this, there's a little piece of you that's a geologist. Because when you look here, what you see are what look like logs that you might see in an old growth forest. And what this is an old growth hydrothermal field. These are logs, they're sulfide logs, that is iron pyrite logs, that have fallen down during earthquake activity. So what you're really looking at is the assemblage of modern skyscrapers and the past history of pieces that have fallen. Now, what I'd like to do is transition from this portion of our program to one that talks about the relationship between earthquake activity and the fluid fluxes that earthquake activity along the faults beneath the seafloor generate. When rocks crack, the fluids are squirted from the rock area up into the overlying water. And when that happens, they carry nutrients that are dissolved in the fluid from the rock up into the overlying ocean, and there are microbes that actually can make a living off of those chemicals because most of them can exchange electrons, either donors or acceptors, but there are microbes that live with that. Now, as part of the program that we had out here earlier, there was a major seismology program, and they were in the third year now of a dramatically new kind of seismology on the seafloor. And on shore, in the studio, stands William Wilcock, who was a seismologist and was out here 3 days ago. He transferred ashore at the same time some of our other colleagues, and the film crew that's with us now were transferred out. So we've stayed on site, and shuttles have come and go. Can I transfer then to William in the studio? William, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Well, one of the really exciting things we've been able to do on the Endeavour segment is to deploy a long-term seismic network to monitor the earthquakes associated with the hydrothermal systems and with the volcano. And the first image I'm going to look at shows the location of the vent fields on the Endeavour segment. And there are a total of 5 segments that are the subject of the cruise at the moment. And that, just to give you a sense of scale, they're spaced about 2 to 3 kilometers apart. And 2 years ago, we deployed a small but very sophisticated seismic network of instruments developed at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute to monitor the seismicity associated with these vent fields in the underlying volcano. And the instruments are positioned in such a way they record the sound waves associated with the earthquakes, and they're able to triangulate onto the location of the earthquakes. And this image shows some of these instruments. The main picture shows the core hole seismometers, and they're deployed horizontally into core holes that are drilled painstakingly with Jason 2 years ago. They took about 6 hours each, and they're placed very snugly in the core holes, and they're able to record the earthquakes associated with hydrothermal fields. We're also able to deploy a broadband instrument that was placed into the sediments. Actually, we excavated out a case on a 24-inch PVC pipe. We're able to excavate the sediments from that and place the instrument into that, and that's what you can see in the lower right-hand part of the image. And that instrument not only records the earthquakes associated with the ridge, but is also able to record the tremor and rumblings of the volcano and the hydrothermal systems. We got the first data from this network last year, and we worked with colleagues from the University of Oregon and with a team of undergraduates to painstakingly locate a year's worth of earthquakes. We located a total of about 12,000 earthquakes, of which about 3,000 are located beneath the vent fields, and that's what you're seeing on this image here. The next animation we're going to see, we're actually going to look from beneath the sea floor. So you're looking up to the sea floor, and the bottom of the image is about 7 kilometers beneath the sea floor. And you're seeing the earthquakes are color-coded by the time they occurred within the year, and throughout the animation you're seeing them sort of flash off. That shows how the earthquakes occurred. And one thing you notice, these earthquakes are sort of in a fairly tight clustering about 2 to 3 kilometers beneath the sea floor. And these earthquakes delineate a region known as a reaction zone. This is where the seawater sinks down and rapidly heats up and reacts with the rocks, and then rises up to the hydrothermal vent fields. And each one of these earthquakes represents the formation of a crack, which enables the fluids to keep circulating. If we didn't have earthquakes forming new cracks, then the system would rapidly clog up because the reaction between the water and the rock creates hydrothermal minerals, alteration minerals, which will fill those cracks. So the earthquakes are essential to keep the system going. And probably will take several years, but we're going to keep on working, analyzing these earthquakes, trying to understand this process a little better. We've got a second year of data. When I got off the ship, we'd pretty much got out the data from all the instruments. And at the moment, they're turning around the instruments, and we hope to collect a third year of data. And I actually have a question for John. I wonder whether he's been able to deploy the remaining instruments during some breaks in the weather, or whether we're still hoping to do that in the remainder of the cruise.
William, we're still hoping to do that. We think we're going to be in a position to do that very shortly. It looks like the weather is abating, and certainly there are 2 high priority items that are on our list to complete before we leave here Monday at noon. And that departure Monday at noon, we'll be back to Seattle. We'll be there Tuesday. In that interval, we have to put 2 more inserts in. You'll hear from Deb about the sulfide incubator inserts, and we'll also put at least 2, if not 3, of your seismometers on the seafloor. We're looking forward to that because none of us have ever played as if we were seismologists. We don't even know how to do that, William, so we'll do that. Now, let me just point out that I'm now in the laboratory on the ship. This is called the main lab. It looks, when you first enter it, it looks a little bit like a bowling alley. It's about 100 feet long, and it has many benches and many places to work within it. And this is where most of the scientists congregate and work on their individual experiments. Over the next probably 20-25 minutes, what you're going to do is hear from each of the scientific groups that's on board about the exciting science that they are doing as part of this cruise, and you'll hear from each of them how they have used the HD camera, which we newly have on board. You saw it on Jason when Deb introduced it. They'll each tell you what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what kinds of results they expect. Now, I want to just introduce Spence Nyholm and his colleague and assistant professor at Harvard, Peter Gerges. And I understand these 2 gentlemen have known each other since they were both in grad school. And they're a very powerful team. We're delighted to have them with us, and we hope that they'll stay with us for quite a long time. Peter, do you want to just start off with a few comments?
Sure. Thank you, John. So John was just telling you about the different programs that are going on and how we've been able to use the HD camera to hone in on some of the questions we have. But for us biologists, it's more than just the images. In order to do our work, we really need to collect samples, and that's where Jason comes into play. Now, if you've been watching us, you've probably seen the videos of the beautiful macrofaunal assemblages of the animal communities that live down in these environments. At hydrothermal vents, we have these big, lush communities of tubeworms and crabs and mussels and everything else that live in these environments, and this is very different from what we see away from the hydrothermal vents.
Yeah, and the reason you get these lush communities is basically because of something called symbiosis. And symbiosis simply means 2 or more organisms that are living with each other. In the case of the tubeworms that you've seen beautiful images of, they're actually bacteria that live in the tubeworms and provide food for the worms. Now, why would you want to study symbiosis? Well, all animals, including you and me, have microbes that live in our bodies. And only a very few of these actually cause disease. The vast majority are actually beneficial or good microbes, but how these good microbes interact with animals is actually poorly understood. Now, the hydrothermal vents offer the perfect opportunity to study these relationships because so many of the animals down there actually have beneficial relationships with microbes. So take the tubeworm, for example. They actually take up chemicals from the environment and transfer that to the bacteria. The bacteria then process those chemicals and sugars are made that the worms grow on.
Yeah, that's right. And so that's, Spencer's pointed out, it's a really unique opportunity to study these really close-knit relationships between animals and microbes. But I mean, how do you do that? that's what we try to do. And the purpose of our being out here is to understand the physiology of these animals and the microbes and how they help feed one another. Now, to do that, we have to recreate the environment that exists on the seafloor here in the lab. It's very different from what you and I are used to living to, and if we could sort of transport one of us down there in an instant, or transport any of us down there, we'd be dead in an instant. Not only is the pressure really high at 4,000 pounds per square inch, which is kind of like balancing a car on a broomstick in the palm of your hand, but also the chemicals are really toxic and would kill any one of us in a matter of minutes. But this is what these worms and microbes need to survive. So to do that, we use equipment that allows us to recreate the high pressures that you see or that we find on the seafloor. So we use high pressure pumps, and this allows us to pump the seawater up to really high pressures. And we put the organisms in high pressure aquaria like this, where we can recreate the high pressures that we find on the seafloor. This allows us to, this particular setup is going to allow us to study some palm worms, these little small worms that have microbes that grow essentially on their backs and around their bodies. It's going to allow us to study those and see how the microbes help feed the worms and vice versa. Now, another thing we study on the seafloor are a lot of the other animals that eat free-living microbes. And for example, this is one of the critters that was a stowaway on the elevator. So never hitch a ride. This is one reason why you shouldn't do that. But this crab came up on the elevator, and this crab grazes on free-living microbes that live at the hydrothermal vents. So this brings up another important point. There's more than just animals living at these hydrothermal vents. The whole community is based on free-living microbes, and these microbes are the basis of the food chain. And my colleague Deb Kelly came up with a really ingenious way of studying these microbes on the seafloor, so I'm going to let her tell you about those.
Thanks a lot, Pete. So one of the things that we've tried to do, people that are interested in what the upper temperature limit of life is on the planet, what are the most extreme conditions under which life can thrive and survive, one of the problems is that traditionally microbiologists have taken samples up from the seafloor and they put them in culturing tubes and tried to recreate kind of the chemical thermal environment that they live in, but that's really difficult to do in these systems. So what John, myself, and others have tried to do is actually develop these in situ incubators that go inside of the chimney walls. And during this program, what we've done is we've taken the robotic vehicle Jason through a program funded by the National Science Foundation, drilled holes into the chimney and actually inserted these incubators. We've recovered a few of these during this program. They've behaved remarkably well. And the idea is that inside of this instrument, we have 4 chambers that are discrete chambers. And there's a series of about 36 temperature probes and some chemical sensors and a way to sample the fluids. So the idea is you put these instruments inside the chimney walls, open them up, and inside of these little chambers are mineral surfaces that have no life on them when we put them in. So what we do is we measure the temperatures and the environmental conditions over, say, a month or a year. We recover these instruments with the microbes that have grown inside of them. And the idea is if we can show inside of one of these chambers that the fluids have never been below, say, 150 degrees Celsius, and we find mineral surfaces that were once sterile that now have microbes growing on it, then it provides really good evidence that these microbes can live at 150 degrees or higher. One of the interesting things that we see is that the microhabitat that these microbes are experiencing are these minerals that are actually the chimney material themselves. And so when we recover these, what we find are very fine-grained minerals, things like iron sulfide and chalcopyrite or copper iron sulfides. And it's those mineral surfaces that the microbes are actually using to colonize. So we've inserted 3 of these during this program, and we recovered 2 of them. Both of them worked extremely well. And we hope to reinsert a couple more during this program, and then next year, using the submersible Alvin, we'll go back and recover them after a year and try and get some time series, a better understanding of how the microbes, how the communities change over time. We know that the organisms can grow double in population in an hour or a few days. And so you can imagine that during the lifetime of a hydrothermal chimney, as the temperatures and environmental conditions change, that the microbial communities also evolve. One of the things that's really important to the microbes is their nutrients. And so the question is, well, how do you keep the nutrients flowing in these systems? The walls and the chimneys go from the outer conditions are about 2 degrees, which is seawater near freezing, and the inner walls are 300 to up to 400 degrees in some environments. And so what we're looking at is basically the gradients within the walls that determine the most extreme environment that you can imagine for these organisms to live in, and that's what we're trying to measure with this instrument. So to sample the fluids, Jeff Wheatwell, who'll meet in just a minute, has also put these tubes that run through the length of the instrument that suck little bits of fluid over time. One of the main things that the organisms need, though, is gases such as carbon dioxide. They live, because there's no sunlight down there, they require magmatic gases, and CO2 happens to be one of the most important magmatic gases in these environments. So our colleagues have developed pretty interesting instruments to actually sample the fluids out of the chimney walls, but also to begin to put sensors inside of the chimneys and look at the gases and the chemical compositions of these fluids. So I think what I can do is pass this over to Ben Larson now, who's been working on instruments that go inside the chimneys to measure the fluid chemistry and also to look at some of the gases that are important to the life down there. So Ben?
Thanks, Deb. As Deb said, we're studying the chemistry of hydrothermal vent fluids. I work with Marv Lilly at the University of Washington, and in particular, we're studying the gas chemistry. And the time-honored approach to doing this is with these 200 milliliter gas-tight bottles, which we go down and they're initially under vacuum, and that allows us to sample a chunk of water in a matter of seconds and to make sure we capture all the gases for that chunk of water. We bring them back up here and we put them on this contraption here, and we extract the water and move all the gas from that water over and concentrate it on this side of the lines and package into these little glass ampules, where we go back on land and we analyze those little ampules for gases like carbon dioxide and hydrogen. And as you know, this method is tried and true, and so it's provided a lot of information about these systems, but it's a discrete method, and so it only gives us a snapshot of what's going on at any given time. And so, as you might imagine, as Deb said, these chemistries changing quite frequently, and so we need a way to kind of see what's going on in between these samples. And so now what we're starting to work on, and it's kind of been under development for a while now, are these sensors. What we have in the middle is a conductivity sensor, which is just a way of determining chloride concentration, and then all around the outside we have a hydrogen sensor, an electrochemical potential, which is just a way of getting at the redox state of the solution, and also temperature. So this is kind of like a information collecting machine, and that's what we're trying to do, is just trying to get an idea of how the chemistry is changing with time, and that's kind of the next stage in this evolution of hydrothermal chemistry. My colleague to my left has some other ways of testing chemistry, and he's going to tell you all about those.
Hi, my name is Jeff Wheat. I'm from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Like Ben, I'm a geochemist. But Ben studies dissolved gases. I study dissolved ions, and of these fluids that are venting from the hydrothermal systems. And with the chemical composition of these fluids, we can tell a lot about hydrothermal processes. How deep does the water flow in the crust? What reactions are taking place in the crust? What reactions are taking place once the waters come up and exit the sea floor? The other thing we can do is get an idea of the extent of microbial activity within the crust based on the different chemical compositions of the fluid coming out. So typically in the past, what we've been using is a big titanium bottle such as this one. It's a giant syringe. What this gives us is one discrete sample in one location at one time. And that's what we've learned a lot from these types of bottles and samples from them. And what we're trying to do now is go with more of a continuous sampler. And this is an osmo pump. What it is on one side of the membrane over here, we have distilled water. On the other side, we have a saturated salt solution. In between, we have some membranes that allows the water to go from the distilled water reservoir to the saltwater reservoir. So we get water flowing, in this case, from my left to my right. And so if we attach a small bore tubing, here's 1,000 feet of small bore tubing, we now have a continuous fluid sampler. And so we can put these in this case, Deb's inserts, to get an understanding of how the chemical composition of the fluids evolve over the lifetime of the experiment. Now, the really cool thing about these two is that not only can we collect samples, we can also inject, say, a trace or a nutrient. So now we can start doing manipulative experiments. And we're just beginning to do some of those manipulative experiments to see both what the hydrogeology of some of these structures are like, as well as the microbial communities and how they may survive or be enhanced by some of these nutrients that we're injecting. So, well, we continue down the hallway here to Ginger. Here you go.
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, my name is Ginger Armbrust, and I'm a biological oceanographer at the University of Washington, and I'm going to take you over to show you the kind of work that we've been doing at sea. First, let me introduce you to my colleague here.
Hi, I'm Rhonda Marole, and I'm a lab technician in Ginger's lab.
So what Rhonda and I are doing out here is we're very interested in the microorganisms that live in the ocean. And being on this cruise, we have the opportunity for the first time to look at the microorganisms that go all the way from the top of the water column in the surface waters all the way down to the deep sea hydrothermal vents. And the reason that we're studying these organisms is because they play a very critical role in modulating the health of our planet. These organisms are microscopic, and yet they impact global processes. Not only do these microorganisms impact the health of our planet, they also tell us something about how we humans, are impacting the health of our planet. So it's critical to understand how these microorganisms function in their environment. And one of the ways that we're doing this is to use this instrument here that we have. This is a flow cytometer, and we affectionately call this instrument LEO. And what LEO is able to do is to analyze characteristics of single-celled microbes. And what LEO can do is LEO can tell us about the number of cells that we find, the size of the cells, and a little bit of something about the characteristics of these cells. What is especially cool about LEO is that if we look over here, this is some of the data that we generate with LEO. It's what we call a scatter plot. And what this shows us is particular characteristics of the individual microbes that we find out there in the ocean. And what we can do is we can say, let's imagine that we would like to learn a little bit more about those green cells that are shown here in this graph. What we can do is tell LEO that we're interested in those green cells, for example. And what LEO does is memorizes those cells that we're interested in those, and then what we can do is take the sample stream that's flowing past lasers, is how we interrogate these cells. The sample stream breaks into droplets. I hope you can see the droplets here forming. Just as those samples break into a droplet, that droplet contains a single cell that we're interested in, and that single cell, LEO now puts a charge on that droplet. And then we can pull those droplets out of the sample stream that's coming through here. We can pull them literally out of the sample stream and catch them in a test tube. That's really amazing, because what that means is that we can take a seawater sample from just off the side of the ship, and that may have hundreds of thousands of different kinds of cells in it, and we can end up at the end of the day with a test tube full of just a single type of cell of interest. Pretty amazing. We can then work with those cells and conduct experiments with them on board the ship. We can also take some of those cells back with us to the laboratory to continue conducting experiments. What we would like to be able to do in the end is to, well, I have to say that LEO does not get to go anywhere else but where LEO is right now. He does not get to go over the side of the ship. It's probably one of the few pieces of equipment that you've seen so far that has to stay where he is. But our goal is in the future to develop LEO-like instruments. I'm working with collaborators in Seattle, Geir van de Eng, and what we'd like to do is to develop an instrument similar to this that we can actually put overboard into the water. And in doing so, we could analyze the cells, the same kind of analyses that we're doing on board the ship, but we can analyze them in real time in the ocean. And what we're very interested in doing is using that kind of technology to then be able to ask even more detailed questions about the cells. Ask who they are, how many there are, and then take it to the next step where we ask, what are the cells doing? And the ways that we're trying to approach this question, the ways that we are approaching this question, are to use what we call right now, we call them ecogenomic sensors. These are sensors that are in the future still, but what they would allow us to do is to use molecular techniques to identify who the organisms are based on DNA, what they're doing based on other molecular probes. And the beauty of these kinds of sensors is that, again, we could do it in real time in the ocean. So we would be able to understand how the microorganisms are functioning and how they are impacting the health of our planet. And we could do this both in surface waters and all the way down at the hydrothermal vents. So I'd like to now turn to my colleague, Deidre Meldrum, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the kind of technologies that's required to develop these kinds of ecogenomic sensors.
Thank you, Ginger. I'm Deirdre Meldrum. I'm a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Washington, and this is my first research cruise. I'm really excited to be here. I've been learning a lot about oceanography, the geology and biology, working with John and others for the past year, and now at the stage where we'll get the opportunity to develop some technologies that'll help them answer some of their really interesting scientific questions. So Ginger just mentioned about ecogenomics. This is taking advantage of technology that's developed during the Human Genome Project to do DNA, RNA, and protein analyses, as well as some cell-based assays that we've been developing in our laboratory. We're after these questions of who is there, what are they doing, and how do they respond to dynamic processes such as the underwater earthquakes, volcanoes, toxic algae blooms, and so on. There's a graphic that you can see that shows some phytoplankton as a toxic algae bloom, and we could, if we have these sensors, we could take samples of them in real time, in situ, and process and learn about their DNA, RNA, and proteins. So that's what our goal is to develop this technology. You currently can't do this, at least for extended periods of time. Ideally, we'd like to have a real presence in the ocean where we can take measurements over time and space. There are some developments. Embari has been developing the ESP. It's an environmental sample processor that has been used for some of their testing. And in my laboratory, and that's why I'm here on the cruise, we're developing technologies to analyze living cells. Ginger was talking about the flow cytometer. That's a snapshot in time of a cell. But we're developing our microscale devices to do stimulus response experiments on cells and on living cells in real time, and do this over time. So we could do experiments for 2 or 3 days, for example. Just want to give you an idea. Some of the parameters we're measuring are oxygen, respiration and consumption rates, gene and protein expression, the RNA, and also some physiological parameters about the cells. We can look at ion fluxes and so on. So what I'd like to do is show you a device we've been working on. And the reason I'm on this cruise is to test these materials that these sensors are made of. But right here, this tiny little piece right here is a chip. It has about 1,000 wells, and we can put a single cell in a well, and each one of these wells has a platinum porphyrin sensor to measure the oxygen, respiration, and consumption rates. So we're developing these devices. Our applications in the controlled laboratory environment are for medicine, cancer, inflammation, HIV, aging, and so on. But what we want to do is further develop these so they can be used in the ocean. So on board the ship, I put some of these devices into this little chamber. There's 4 compartments. And these will go down on the Jason underwater robot into one of the hydrothermal vents and also a diffuse site. And we're going to see how these materials survive. My guess is that the borosilicate and the fused silica will probably dissolve. The only thing we'll have left probably is our sapphire samples. Each one of them is coated with this porphyrin material. Once we have materials that are robust for the environment, we'll further develop them, and our goal is to be able to do these measurements in situ on the seafloor or in the water column. To do that, what we'd really like is a capability called Neptune that would have a cabled underwater observatory to provide high power and high bandwidth. And what we want to be able to do with that facility is develop these power and robotically control these distributed sensor networks in the ocean. And they would be able to sample and monitor dynamically changes in the environment. And so they could flow through different volumes of the sea. And another part of this that we'll need is the high definition TV capability, the camera capability, so that we can see what we're doing on the seafloor and take these measurements. So I'd like to turn this over now to John, and he's going to tell you more about Neptune.
Yeah, you recall that I talked earlier about the idea that oceanographers are becoming extraordinarily interested in being able to explore the time domain as well as the spatial domain. And being able to explore the time domain requires that we be able to be in the environment all the time, online, 24/7, 365 for decades. Well, it turns out that's not so easy to do. It's one thing for us to be out here with a camera crew and a satellite, a handy satellite, which actually the one we're using right now is 22,500 kilometers above the equator, but that's not so convenient on a routine basis, and it's very, very expensive. So one of the other visions that are being developed within the ocean sciences community is the concept that we will have other ways of communicating with systems that are within the ocean and on the seafloor. The concept behind that is being driven by a program called Orion, Ocean Networks for Interactive Ocean Science, and Orion is a program that is being supported in part by the National Science Foundation, and it's part of a program that's going to move us into a new era of science. The reason that new era of science has the potential of coming to fruition is a program that the National Science Foundation has developed, which is called the MREFC program, and that offers us opportunities to aspire far beyond the normal research crews like the ones we're on. We are hoping to be empowered by a variety of sources to take a bold new step, almost a NASA scale step forward in looking at submarine hydrothermal systems, in looking at how global networks of seismologists, seismometry, and surface moorings distributed throughout the entire planet. There would be spaced at about 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers apart, and they would communicate by satellite. So there would be many, many tens of those, as you can imagine, throughout the oceans. Another part of this Ocean Observatory initiative, which we hope will develop for our science, is an enhanced coastal oceanography capability, and that coastal oceanography capability will be empowered by new developments that either involve specialized kinds of moorings or short cables, perhaps, or a variety of efforts that will focus on our coastal waters where there are great extreme pressures driven by the populations that tend to cluster around the shorelines, and that's a serious issue that we have to face. We've been doing global oceanography and coastal oceanography, and we're fairly skilled at doing that. What we need is the help to do it better, and that's what this Ocean Observatory initiative could bring about. What hasn't been done before, and what's especially exciting to me, is the concept of a regional cabled observatory in which an area somewhere on the seafloor is selected to be hardwired to thousands of kilometers of fiber optic cable. And where those cables in a network, the cables laid in a network, would allow us to have nodes throughout the cables, all along the cables, that would have power and plug-ins, a way of plugging in to the internet. So we would have very high bandwidth capability from those sites and very high power supply. So it's effectively turning whatever that area is into a laboratory that's the scale of a tectonic plate. In some cases, we think about it being off the coast of Washington and Oregon. We think of it as it's called Neptune, the Northeast Pacific Time Series Undersea Networked Experiments. And that program has been initiated by our Canadian colleagues, and they have formed a partnership with the National Science Foundation to pursue the concept of Neptune. And Neptune is a vision, really, of how science could be conducted in the oceans in the future with very, very high bandwidth, with the capability of empowering the kinds of instruments that Ginger was talking about, with the capability of empowering the kinds of capabilities that Didi and Debbie and Pete Gerges and a host of other scientists that are interested in both the water column, the overlying ocean, possibly the air-sea exchange, and certainly the seafloor and subseafloor. These would be these technological breakthroughs of having power and bandwidth available to us anywhere throughout the ocean would be a phenomenal step forward. The scientists have already begun to marshal their arguments and their thoughts and their concepts and their ideas, and even as we speak, there's a group evaluating a wide variety of proposals that have been submitted to suggest the kind of science that could be done. Now, one of the problems that we face in having a very, very high bandwidth system that can have thousands and thousands of instruments and robots distributed through the ocean is we have to manage it. We have to figure out how to actually accumulate the data, how the data comes ashore, where it's stored, how it's stored, what the architecture for that storage is, and basically how it's accessed by the scientists, how it's accessed by the public and by policymakers, and in fact, in the best of worlds, how the network itself with thousands of sensors on it becomes almost a dare I say, artificially intelligent thinking, sensing network that can detect the passage of pods of blue whales or the occurrence of big earthquakes or an erupting underwater volcano, and then reconfigure the assets, the robots, the sensors, to actually respond to those unpredictable perturbations that actually take place within the ocean and on the seafloor. This is a huge challenge, this idea of the infrastructure using computers and communications to do this. Now, one of my colleagues from the University of Washington, Ed Lazowska, I believe is standing by in the studio where William Wilcox spoke to you earlier. And Ed is probably one of the world's experts on how these kinds of cyber infrastructural frameworks could be put together. And I'll ask Ed to say a few words on that regard. Ed, can I ask you to step forward and speak?
I'll sit here and speak, John. It's good to see you and Deb and Dee Dee and everyone else out there, and it's good to be on dry land. John's talked about a couple of different transitions that have occurred. He's talked about the weather transition and the oceanography transition, and you know, there's a third transition, and it's a transition in computational science. Now, if I were John, 10 minutes of T.S. Eliot would pop to mind for your entertainment, but I'll spare you that. You know, science historically has been done really in two ways. There's theory. You sort of imagine mathematically maybe how the weather works or how a chemical reaction occurs. And then there's experiment and measurement. You measure a reaction, you measure the weather, you use instruments on the seafloor. And over the past 30 years, there's this new form of science we call computational science. And typically that's involved big simulation models that run on supercomputers. And weather models, climate models are an example everyone's familiar with. The transition that's taking place now is towards a form of computational science that's focused on data and sensors. And so these are data sensors streaming back enormous amounts of data, and your competitive advantage is extracting knowledge from that data. So what are these sensors? One example is arrays of charge-coupled devices and telescopes. And that's how astronomy is done these days, these enormous databases that represent data about the heavens that these CCD arrays are collecting. Another is data in the civilian infrastructure from sensors. So we put strain sensors and accelerometers on bridges and buildings, and we understand what's happening in real time. And the third example is what's going to come from the new oceanography, these regional cabled observatories and other forms of sensors. The sensors that Dee Dee is building and others are building, her colleagues at MBARI, they're distributed around the seafloor. Some of them are permanent, some of them are deployed on an as-needed basis, and they're streaming enormous amounts of data back. And that data is being stored and it's being mined for information. It's being visualized, and it's available to students in the classroom in the same way that it's available to scientists in their laboratories. So it's a real transformation in how we think about doing science. It's sort of a fourth leg of the stool. There's experiment and measurement, there's traditional theory, there's traditional computational science, which is these big simulation models, and then there are these robotic sensor networks streaming data back and the analysis of that data. So it's a new capability that allows us to understand the world in ways that we just haven't been able to do it before. So it's tremendously exciting for all of us, and it's a great marriage between computer science and these other scientific disciplines. It's really going to change all of our fields. John, back to you, pitching on the ship.
Ed, thanks very much. Let us hope that this marriage produces fertile offspring in terms of many generations of both science and students. It's speaking of the students and getting the word about oceanography and the science of oceanography and the world of environmental sciences in general through both to the public and to students, and through students perhaps to their parents. We have on board a program that was initiated by Veronique Robigoux more than 10 years ago, and one of the premier graduates of that program is standing here with me. His name is David Randall, and David works with the American Museum of Natural History and is with us today as the onboard representative of the REVEL program. His mentor, Veronique Robigoux, is there in the studio, and she left 3 days ago with William Wilcock, and they transferred at midnight from this ship to another one in some high winds, but it was safely done. And David, it's a delight to have you on board. You've been with us now for almost 2 weeks. And the last time I remember that we were out to sea together, we were doing this business of mapping the seafloor and picking up the big rocks. And you've been involved in both the REVEL program as well as that early sulfide recovery program. I wonder if you could say a few words about REVEL in general, and we have some very engaging and very challenging teachers. They ask us questions that we have a hard time answering sometimes. The teachers think differently than we do, so there's a rich interplay between the teachers on board and the way the scientists think. So, David?
Well, I have to say it's really a pleasure to be here. That I have in the 7 years since I last sailed with you, the technology was amazing then, and it's even you just saw it. It's incredible now. The REVEL program, REVEL stands for Research, Education, Volcanoes, Earth, and Life. And so we're looking at all the things that you've just heard about for the last hour, but we're looking at it from an education perspective. And the idea is that if we take teachers out and show them this science, that science can be translated back to the kids. We can't bring classrooms full of kids out here, but we can bring teachers. And just as an example, in the 7 years since I sailed, I've taught over 1,000 children. And granted, that's partly a result of overcrowding in the classrooms, but there's a huge reach. There's over almost 70 teachers who've been through the REVEL program. So you can imagine the amount of kids this is reaching. Teachers from REVEL have done presentations at the National Science Teachers Association and several other conferences, including the AGU. Teachers from REVEL have written teachers' guides for the IMAX show, Volcanoes of the Deep. Teachers from REVEL, 3 teachers from REVEL have actually dove to the bottom of the sea in the submersible Alvin. So it's been an incredible program. It's completely changed the way I look at teaching. And I think, Veronique, you're in the studio waiting for us?
Thank you, Dave, for your introduction to the REVEL program. And I'm glad to see you again. We've been working for the past 10 days together, and I was sorry to leave the ship, but I had a mission, I guess, to accomplish on land too. And today I'm glad to talk to you. And I'm also glad to see, I've seen the teachers in the background. They've been very quiet during this program. But while Peter Gergis and Debbie Kelly were showing us their experiments and sharing with us the type of science that they're doing, we could see them diligently working on their research project. One of the things that Dave has not mentioned, and we're going to continue to talk about this with Dave in the next few minutes, is the fact that what we're trying to do with the REVEL program is, because the type of science that we're doing now, this multidisciplinary science, is getting so complex, it's very difficult to translate directly into the classroom with the traditional methods that we have of teaching in the classroom. And so what we're slowly starting to develop with REVEL is, in a way, a new breed of teachers that actually understand the research process and have been part of the research process. And we put them through a grueling training and experience on the cruise, and we actually expect from them that they go through that research process in a very short period of time. So David, would you explain a little bit what the teachers have been doing with you for the past 10 days and what you anticipate they're going to do before they leave the ship, and what they're going to talk about for their presentation at the end of this cruise?
Well, I mean, you mentioned that they've been sitting here quietly, and they haven't been quiet for most of the trip. They've been busy but asking scientists about their work. helping scientists with their work. A lot of them are involved in the collection of data and helping to process the data. As one of the requirements for REVEL, they do their own project. I used to jokingly refer to mine as my science fair project, but it's really more than that. It's doing cutting-edge research with research scientists. We have 2 projects that are dealing with mapping. One this year that's dealing with using the data from the seismographs that Will Wilcox put down to track whales. And we have one that's dealing with more of a sociological study of what goes on a research vessel. And these presentations will take place on the way back, usually, to the whole ship. And so it becomes a great social event and kind of a culmination of the teachers' work. So let me introduce you to the teachers. Down at the very end there is Joe Dodds from O'Leary High School. I'm sorry, O'Leary Junior High in Twin Falls, Idaho. Next to her is Carol Dundorf from Hershey Middle School in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And then we have Mary Goff from Crater High School in Central Point, Oregon. And Teresa Panilla from Stockbridge Middle School in Stockbridge, Georgia. And just to kind of, I could talk about what it did to me in my teaching, but Teresa, you've been out here for about 2 weeks now, kind of thrown in the middle of all this incredible technology and this incredible science. And I know that you've never been out to the middle of the sea and doing this kind of research before. What insights do you have, and how do you think that you can take this experience, and I guess what words do you have for other teachers and students right now based on the last 2 weeks?
Well, we have discussed all of this among the 4 of us over the last week or so, and what we see going on is very much interdisciplinary. No one scientist is working in isolation. They are consulting with each other. They are sharing data and sharing resources, because this is the kind of work that you cannot do by yourself. So there's this tremendous cooperation across disciplines, and this is an area of research that is just changing almost day by day. And I know it's already changing the way that I am thinking about what my classroom will be and what will be going on in my classroom. And so I'm really looking forward to getting back and sharing it with my students, and also bringing some of this experience to other teachers.
Thanks, Teresa. Just from the perspective of how it changed my teaching in 7 years since I sailed with REVEL, the idea that science is a process, I had ideas about it, but I didn't understand it until I sailed with REVEL. When you're out here, you're dealing with the mistakes that get made, the accidents that happen, the things that don't quite go right, the successes. You really see the process of science in action. And when I went back to my classroom after sailing with REVEL, I realized that the textbook was really kind of the stepping stone to doing science, and that science wasn't really about what's in the textbook, but science is really about finding questions, finding good questions that you can find answers to, and then working towards answering those questions, and getting the kids to realize that the answers really aren't the goal necessarily, because those questions always lead to more questions. Veronique, you have people in the studio that may have some questions for us on board the ship here?
We have students here that represent the classrooms that Teresa and Dave were just talking about. And we have time for a couple of questions that maybe are going to be forwarded to some of the scientists on board. So I would like to introduce Corinne from Tolt Middle School, who's also in a class with one of the REVEL teachers, and then Paul and Dowdy that have both come, that are 12th graders, and have both come from the Orca Academy in Everett in Washington. So if you have a question, either of you have a question, we would like to hear from you now.
I have a question that's directed to anybody that has an opinion. I'm just wondering, do you guys think that this is the next space, I guess? What will happen from here?
Edie, the question was, young lady asked that if she kind of likened what's going on out here to exploring space, and since you're kind of on the cutting edge of a lot of the technology, can you maybe say something about how this work compares to what's going on in space?
Is this the next space?
The next space.
Yeah, actually, so the technology we're developing for the harsh environment of the ocean could be relatively easily translated and used for discovery of what's going on other planets. So I think this provides a really nice test bed, if you will, for doing planetary exploration. And there are a lot of sensor development going on at NASA and other places.
And in a broader sense, there's no question that by working in the environment of the ocean on this planet, looking at the ways that volcanoes can support life without sunlight, we are indeed perhaps working in analog type oceans that might exist on other planets, where we know there's volcanism on other planets, we know there's a lot of water on other planets. So by doing the kinds of studies we're conducting here, we're preparing ourselves not only to understand our own planet, but whatever we learn can be exported to oceans elsewhere, which are the likely planets to bear life, frankly. And so we're quite excited about it. It's a kind of Zen thing, you know, looking inward in order to look outward.
It's one of John's favorite questions, but...
Was there another question?
So here is Paul's question.
Yes.
Thank you, Veronique. So this is a question for the teachers on board your research crews. Do they see themselves sort of incorporating into a nationwide program? I believe this is just from a few states at the moment. I'm kind of curious as to see if this is the next nationwide step in education.
Okay, the question was for the REVEL teachers, and they of course can't hear you. We only get your voice here, so I have to repeat the question. But the question was, do you see what you're doing as kind of like a step on the way to a nationwide program? And Mary, could you kind of speak to that?
Certainly a nationwide, if not an international recognition of the importance of the ocean and how much the ocean impacts everyone around us. We have the different interdisciplines that are involved, and it becomes increasingly important as we understand the role of the oceans in everyone's life to share that with the classrooms of the world.
Our last question, Dave, is going to come from Dowdy, and she's also from the Archea Academy at Everett in Washington State.
Thank you. I would like to ask, how does it feel to combine all the different programs, I guess, the scientists and as well as engineers and people who are doing the communication process through all this?
Can Debbie Kelly step in? The question is, how can the work that we're doing here kind of combine all, different aspects of like the chemistry, the biology, the technology? So what?
This cruise really exemplifies that. What we're looking at right now is really the linkages between volcanoes, seismicity, and life on the planet. And certainly the mid-ocean ridge system is one of the key places on the planet where all those processes come together. And so early on, when people used to go to sea, when I was just starting out, say 20, 25 years ago, we would send out cruises and there'd be a geologist on board, and the whole cruise would focus around the volcanic rocks on the surface. And over those times, since that time, what we're starting to realize is to understand how our planet works, to understand how the organisms thrive, how the significant processes work, that we really had to look at all the linkages. And so for this cruise, we have geologists, chemists, fluid chemists, and microbiologists, macrofaunal people that look at all the processes in an integrated sense. So it's a great question.
Thanks, Abby. Well, I guess that's all the questions. Veronique, we'll see you on land next week, and I look forward to getting my land legs back.
Okay, I'm looking forward greeting you on Tuesday, Dave, and you and all the teachers and all the scientists that are coming back from the wonderful Fuca Ridge. For now, we're going to continue a little bit with these questions, and we have some great players here in the room all together. We've got representative of middle schools and then high schools, and of course, we also have Chris Ludwig, our graduate student, and I would like that we have a little bit of time all together to discuss some of the things that we've heard this afternoon. You've all been exposed to the fact that this type of science and this type of research now is getting very complex, and it's this intermix that you were talking about, Dowdy. How do you think you guys can fit, even if you don't become oceanographers, how do you think this kind of research or this kind of science can either impact you in the future, or how do you think it could be included in your classroom?
I would say I'm not interested in oceanography per se, but the engineering aspect of it, now I understand more how that comes into play and how you guys can actually collaborate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very good. That's something that Chris and I have been talking a lot about, is that you don't have to become an oceanographer to actually contribute to some of these expeditions, or even to the type of science that's done on these expeditions, because there's so many different aspects that need to fit together so that the kind of science that Debbie Kelly and John Delaney are doing actually move forward. Corinne, do you have any ideas of how this might impact, what you do in the classroom, maybe with your teacher over the next few months?
I'm very interested in how we might use this information somewhere else. Like, this might not be the only place that these things are found. So
you're interested in space again. You're going back to other planets, right? Yeah, we've noticed Holt Middle School as a great attraction for space in general. Great. Chris, do you have a question for them?
Well, I just want to know, what's your opinion on using this kind of technology in your classroom? Would you guys prefer reading something out of a textbook, or would you like to log into a live data feed from something like the Neptune Observatory? What would you do with that as a student?
Well, technology, it brings new and great things in high definition, so to speak, to experience new and great things that you normally might not be able to get out of a textbook. Many textbooks can be outdated, and just having this live stuff brings you the top cutting edge of what's really going on.
Maybe this is a good place for us to end. We're going to go back underwater to end the show and look at some of the beautiful high definition video that we've gotten. But I think, I love what you just said, Paul. This emphasizes the fact that you can actually live through some of these expeditions, brings the aspect of discovery that really you don't have access to in the textbook, because the discoveries are made. Once they're in the textbook, they've made and kind of understood, and this is where the discoveries are happening and opening new doors for new discoveries. And that's the message we want to leave with the students now, is that there's so much more to learn out there on our own planet, and also in space, of course, on other planets. We are going back on board now. So we're going back on board and going to hopefully hear some wise words of wisdom from the co-chief scientist, John Delaney.
Thank you, Veronique. I'm not sure I have any special wisdom at this point, but it's been a lot of fun. It's been very exciting to hear all the science that's been going on. I think each of us learned a bit as the whole process took place, and that's what these cruises are about in many ways. Oceanographers are especially skilled at interdisciplinary science, and yet we still have a lot to learn about how to do it. The oceans in transition, the transformation taking place in oceanography today, the fascination with the need to understand time, with looking at the time domain. You cannot understand a particular feature that you see on the seafloor unless you can watch how that feature or features like it evolve through time. So T.S. Eliot did have it right. Time is critical, time past, time present, time future. We need to understand all of those. We need to be able to have access to all of them at our fingertips to really understand the system. It's extremely important also for us to be able to have these kinds of high definition windows on our world to engage the public, to engage scientists that exist in other fields, and students, teachers, and maybe next generation scientists who will become users of a system like Neptune, perhaps, in time. I want to thank many of the folks that have helped us here. The list is far too long, and I think that what I'd like to do is remind all of you that we feel like you're here with us in spirit, and the credits will be rolled at the end. We'll deeply appreciate what each and all of you have done. I want to come back then to the final point where oceanography is at a crossroads. Perhaps we all are at crossroads, at a place where we start down one path or start down another, and we have to make those decisions. We cannot dither, can't just watch. And again, to end on one of my weaknesses, which is poetry, and which I struggled with yesterday. I got a wonderful email from my son listing the program the poem that I tried to remember yesterday and I forgot. And he said, "Here it is, memorize it, Dad. Do it now," says my son Ryan. And oceanography is at this crossroads, where two roads diverge in the yellow wood. And sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. And then took the other as just as fair, for it was grassy and wanted wear, though as to that the passing there had worn them really about the same. Oh, I left the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted that I would ever be back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Oceanography has to choose the path it's going to follow, and we have to go for it with gusto and joy and take the lumps, the bumps, and the victories that come with it. And that's partly what this cruise has been about. We've had lumps, bumps, and victories, and we're glad to share them all with you, quite candidly, quite openly, and with the promise that we'll be back. Thanks so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Visions 05, Expedition to the Underwater Volcanoes of the Northeast Pacific, is a joint project of the National Science Foundation, the W.M. Keck Foundation, Neptune, the University of Washington, the Pacific Northwest Gigapod, and the Research Channel. Special thanks to the Neptune Ocean Observatory project partners and participants. Visions 05 Expedition technical and equipment support provided by